Today we're going to be installing the Ender 7 ZX's upgrade kit on this Ender 7. This Ender 7 already has the volcano style hot end, so it's going to look a little bit different. We're going to first start by removing the stock bed. You're going to take off your 4 leveling knobs, then unscrew your harness from the back of the bed. 4 knobs are off. I'm going to be using silicone bumpers instead of the springs on the kit. You're going to pull these off and pull the bed out and set it to the side. Grab your springs and set those to the side along with your leveling knobs. Go ahead and take out the Z-axis limit switch. Take out the Z-axis limit switch knob here, the height. Put that to the side. I'm going to pop this black cover off. We're going to take out all 8 of these screws up top. Then there's 2 screws underneath here on the back side you want to take out. Then we'll pull this whole bed off. Once you get all 12 screws out, the 8 on top, then the 2 on either sides, depending on how tight your wheels are, either the brackets may drop down, so be careful. Don't let the bed flex on the lead screw bracket there. You could bend it. For those that are using the stock backer plate, which I'm calling this the backer plate, you're going to keep this all intact. You'll be reusing this. Slide your brackets down to the bottom. You want to loosen these front screws here with an Allen key and hold the nut with a pair of pliers or a wrench, but loosen the front nuts on both brackets, or the top and bottom nuts on the front on both brackets. Once you have your front brackets loose, or your front wheels loose, they'll just be able to come off like that. You slide the back end around, it'll come off. Next, we want to loosen both of these socketed cap screws here and slide the coupling down against the bottom plate here. Now that this is loose, you can slide this down. Then you can lift up. You can lift up on the entire assembly and pull the bottom out, and this whole thing will come out. Once the assembly's out, you want to remove your screws that are holding the backlash nut in. We will not be reusing this anti-backlash nut. Once your screws are loose, go ahead and take the bracket off. Once the bracket's off, go ahead and unthread your anti-backlash nut off your lead screw. Left is a pile of parts and a clean Ender 7 to begin the install of the Z-axis upgrade kit. Make sure you have all your parts. I went with the 400mm black linear guides. You need your assortment of M3 screws and T-nuts for the linear guides, your M5 and T-nuts for your brackets, your bearings and retaining cap screws, your M3 screws for your brackets to the linear rail, your M5 screws to mount your backer plate, of course your leveling knobs, then your assortment of bearings and screws for your tensioner, your backlash nuts, your 2 tension nuts, and 2 400mm long lead screws, and your printed brackets. Our printed parts here, we got our spacers 1 through 5. We got our tensioner assembly, that's where our tensioner arm, our brackets for our tensioner, our spacers for the bearings. We got our upper blocks, our lower blocks. We got our right and left blocks and our rear block. And these are the these are the linear guide jigs. After you get your supports broken off, you want to go through and clean up all the little fuzzies. A heat gun works best. I just use this little pencil heat gun. After cleaning up all your parts, You want to make sure your bores are smooth and there's nothing in them. And we're ready to put the heat certs in. We're using M5 by 8 by 7s. After you get your heat nut inserts in, if there is any ridges raised up, just take a file and file the ridges down a little bit. You want it smooth across the top. After you got your M5 8 by 7 heat nut inserts in, if you're still using the stock Z-axis limit switch and the adjustable screw with the spring, you want to put your M4 by 8 by 6 heat nut insert in here. Also, in the tensioner bracket, there's one M5 by 8 by 7 heat nut insert that goes in the end of that. Make sure you go in from the inside or from this side. Next is to clean up these bearing retainer screw holes. You take a 2.5mm drill bit and drill and clean these up. Clean these little screw holes up on all your bearing block brackets. After you clean up these holes, the small holes, with a 2.5mm drill bit, take your flange bearings and push them into the holes. They are somewhat of a snug fit. Once you get them started, you can flip them over and press them against the desk. Then we're going to put in our bearing retainer screws. You can just take your bearings and set them on top, and you can push them in. Then once they're started, flip it over and push them in the rest of the way against your desk or the floor. Then we're going to take our screws, and these screws are going to keep the bearings from coming out. Tighten the screws down. They will be just on the flange. That's all you want. You snug them down. Next, we're going to use our M3 by 35 socketed cap screws, and we're going to mount the anti-backlash nut to the top of our brackets. And we're going to feed the screws in from underneath. We have the top part of our anti-backlash nuts installed. You don't need to tighten the screws down super tight, just snug. We're going to assemble the tensioner now. We need 2 of the flange bearings. Then we're going to put our bearing spacers into the bearings. Flip one of these over, stack the other one. These bearings stacked are going to go into the end of the tensioner. Use your M4 by 35 screw to go in from the top. Here's our tensioner assembled. You need to add a M4 nylon lock nut to the bottom here. Then we're going to put our M5 cap head screws through our tensioner brackets and put our T-nuts on the bottom. M5 socketed cap screws and T-nuts are installed. Take your M5 by 40 socketed cap screw and feed it into the rear of your tensioner bracket. There you go. This is the tensioner screw. After you clean up your brackets and spacers and put your nut inserts inside your brackets, you can move on to your linear guides. I'm going to start by putting on my M3 screws and T-nuts on here. It's up to you if you want to fill every hole. I suggest it. Not required. You can probably skip every other one if you wanted to. We're not milling stuff with this machine. We're printing, so there's not too much load on these linear guides. I got all 4 linear rails with all the T-nuts and screws in. It is recommended to take a little magnet and stick it on the linear rail. This will help to keep the guide blocks from falling all the way down. I'll just keep them up out of the way for now. We got our 4 magnets on. Next, we're going to install our linear guides. You need the 4080 jigs and the 4040 jigs. And I'll show you how to put these on here. Easiest way to do this is to make sure all your T-nuts are somewhat lined up, and you're going to be putting it into the front slot of these front brackets. You can just kind of wiggle it in and it'll go in. This is where your magnet helps. When you have this installed, you want to slide the top to the top of your bracket here, and you want it to just line up with the top of the bracket and snug your top screw. After your top screw is snug, you can take your 40/40 jigs and clip them around the linear guide and your extrusion. These jigs are a tight fit, so don't be afraid to kind of force them in there. You'll see they clip around the back and they clip around the linear guide here. You're going to go ahead and loosen your top screw. This will make sure the jig is centered on top of your extrusion. Now go through and progressively snug up all these screws. You want to do that for the left and for the right. Once you get all your screws a little snug, you can go back and tighten them up with your Allen wrench. Now that your left and right sides are on, we'll move to the back. Same kind of process, except we're going to put both linear guides on up top, and they're going to meet to the top bracket here, to the bottom of the top bracket. Then we'll put our jigs on and go through and progressively tighten them. Same thing, we got our jigs on. We loosen our top screws so everything's centered. Make sure your jigs are tight. Then we'll go through from top to bottom, snug them up, then come back and tighten them down. Now that we have our rear and both our side linear guides on, we're going to install the rear bracket, then our left and right. We have our rear bracket, our belt, one idler pulley. We're going to grab the other half of our anti-backlash nut and thread it on to our rear lead screw. Take our rear lead screw and we're going to thread it into our rear bracket through the bottom and into our backlash nut. Once you have the lead screw started, you can take your spring and the other half of your backlash nut, compress it, then thread your lead screw the rest of the way through your anti-backlash nut. Once installed, it's going to look like this. Make sure it's compressed all the way, and the little fingers on the top part of your anti-backlash nut is all the way down into the relief on the bottom part. Next, we're going to install an idler pulley on the lead screw. Go ahead and tighten up one of your set screws here. Once you have your timing gear on your lead screw assembly here, you're going to make sure your belt is wrapped around your lead screw. To install your lead screw is reverse of when you disassembled it. You're going to slide the top. There's a little hole in the top bracket that you can feel. Slide the bottom in and set it inside your collar. Make sure you don't forget your belt. After that, you're going to install your guide blocks to your bracket using your M3 screws. Just lightly put these in. We'll tighten them up in a later step. Now that you have your guide blocks lightly screwed into your rear bracket, you can take spacer number 2 and slide it in underneath your lock collar. This sets the height for everything. Now that the spacer number 2 is in, go ahead and drop your collar to on top of the spacer. Make sure the belt's not in the way, and tighten up your bottom set screw. After your bottom set screw is tight, you can pull your spacer out. Then to tighten the coupling against your lead screw, you want to lift up just a little bit on your lead screw to make sure that the lead screw is not right against the motor shaft or it's not touching up there. So you just lift up just a little bit and you'll feel that there's a little bit of a space in there that it's not hitting. And when you feel that, go ahead and tighten up your top set screw. After you tighten up your top set screw, you can go ahead and tighten up your timing gear. To do this, you'll snug up one set screw and you'll feel it lock into, let's see if I can do this one-handed. You'll feel it lock into one of the grooves on the lead screw, and then you can rotate it down and snug up against your lock collar. Make sure there's no gap between your timing gear and the top of the collar. Now you have your timing gear snugged up. You can check to make sure your bracket slides up and down using your thumb. Next step is to install your tensioner bracket. Need spacer number 4. We're going to set that on top of the rear bracket like that, on top of the rear plate. Then we'll slide our bottom mount on top of that. The tensioner brackets do have a lip to hook into the back of the extrusion, so make sure that is happening and go ahead and snug them down. Then after the bottom one's snug, we'll put our top one on and do the same, and make sure the lip is around the back of the extrusion and snug it up. After the rear bracket, after the tensioner bracket is installed, make sure they're all snugged up tight. Pull your spacer out. Take your M4 by 60 millimeter screw. Put your tensioner in and slide everything through. Then you take your M4 nylon lock nut and put it on the bottom here and just snug it up. It doesn't need to be tight. Before we install our left and right brackets, you want to measure in between. You want to measure from the outside of this bottom plate, the outside of this bottom plate, and make sure the measurement is the same from the outside of this bottom plate to the outside of this bottom plate. This will make sure your front tubes, your front extrusions are not going to pinch the assembly as it rides up and down the guide rails. This measurement from outside of this bracket to the outside of this bracket should be 425 millimeters. You can loosen your screws and adjust accordingly. Make sure your top and your bottom are both 425 from outside to outside. We'll do the same thing with our left and right brackets. Slide our lead screw in from the bottom, put our backlash, the top half of our anti-backlash nut on. Then we'll put on our guide blocks and install the assembly on our left hand side. With the top half of our anti-backlash nut on, we're going to take our top bracket. We'll take our top bracket and slide it on with the bearing facing the backlash nut, anti-backlash nut. There we go. Next, we'll take a timing gear and slide it on the bottom. Then we'll take our bottom bracket, slide it on after that. It'll be a whole lot easier to do two hands. Take your thrust bearing assembly, slide it on. Then take a tension nut, thread it on, and we're gonna just snug up this set screw. We need to install our M5 socketed cap screws and T-nuts on both the bottom and the top bracket. Once you have your whole assembly ready to go, your bottom bracket, tension nut, thrust bearing, bottom bracket, idler pulling, lead screw, bracket, anti-backlash nut, and top bracket. I'm going to make sure you get the belt onto the bracket Go ahead and install your whole assembly. Make sure spacer number 1 is down on top of the aluminum bracket, and then go ahead and install everything here. Once you have everything sitting where it needs to go, you can tension up one of these bolts here. This will keep the whole assembly upright while you get everything set. So now that I have this screw snugged up, this is going to get raised up here, but we're going to mount everything down here first. Bottom bracket's still loose. You want the bottom bracket to be against the spacer, and you want to stick spacer number 5 underneath the lead screw. This will set your height also. If you find that your tension nut and lead screw is holding you up from pushing your bracket all the way down, loosen up your set screw on your tension nut, and that'll allow the tension nut to fall down, unscrew a little bit, and set your bracket on top of your spacer. Make sure it's nice and tight, and make sure your lip here is around the extrusion, and go ahead and tighten everything up. Now that your 4 screws are tightened in your bracket, you can pull your spacer out. Put that on the other side. Ready for that. After you put your spacer over there, take spacer number 3 and put it up here. This sets the height of this bracket, your top bracket here. Loosen your screw that you snugged up to keep everything aligned, and slide your top bracket up to your spacer. Next, you want to tighten up your idler pulley. Take your Allen head and lightly snug up one of these set screws. You'll feel it lock into a groove. Make sure your timing pulley is against your top of your bearing flange here, or against the top of your flange bearing. Then go ahead and tighten both set screws. Now that your timing gear set screws are tight, take your Allen head for your tension nut, put it into your set screw, and rotate your lead screw looking from the top clockwise. This will drive up the tension screw, and you'll feel it get tight. Once it gets tight, once the tension nut gets tight against your thrust bearings, go ahead and tighten up your set screw. Once you tighten up your set screw and your tension nut against your thrust bearing, check to make sure your lead screw, if you pull up and down, there's no movement in it. This will ensure that your tension nut is tight enough. If there is a little bit of play up and down in your lead screw, loosen your set screw and do it again, and tighten up your tension nut against the thrust bearing, and tighten up your set screw. If you find that you keep having the same issue where there's a little bit of play, go ahead and take your tension nut off and rotate it a quarter turn and put it back in. This will put your set screw in a different groove. Right side, same as left side. We'll get our M5 screws and T-nuts installed on our brackets. Our brackets onto the lead screw, and the top half of the anti-backlash nut onto the lead screw. The right-hand assembly, tension nut, thrust bearing, bracket with the flange bearing facing up. Our timing gear, bracket, anti-backlash nut, and our top bearing block. Go ahead and put this onto our right side in the same fashion we did our left side. As you put on the right side bracket, you want to make sure your timing belt is around your rear pulley, your tensioner, your left side pulley, and your right side pulley. Now we're going to install our left bracket onto our guide block, and our right bracket onto our right guide block using the M3 screws provided. You may find that you need to take your tensioner back off to be able to line everything up. But now we're going to rotate our lead screws with the timing gear, and we're going to measure from the top of our brackets down to the base, and we're going to set We're going to set all of them at the same height. The easiest way to measure the brackets is to take one of your spacers, set it on top, measure down from the bottom of your spacer or the top, whichever one, into your base. Make sure all three brackets are the same measurement. You will be able to turn it. If you take the tensioner off, you'll be able to turn the lead screws and the belt will slip on the timing gears. Once that's set, take your tensioner and put your tensioner back in. And get your tensioner back in. This will put tension on the belt, so none of the lead screws will move, and the lead screws will not move independently anymore. They will all be tied together. Again, put your nut on the bottom, and you don't need much tension on this. You'll come to find out how much tension you need. If it's too tight to turn, then you need to reduce your tension. It will feel kind of stiff because you are moving 3 guide blocks on linear rails plus a stepper motor. But that's one nice thing about this kit. Once your print's done, you can grab this belt and move it up and down. Next, we're going to put our aluminum backer plate on. For the guys that are using the stock backer plate, set your stock backer plate on and put your M5 screws in the back. Then take your clamps and put your clamps on and put your M5 screws on your clamps. Another way to check to see if everything's level is to put your backer plate on your rear bracket, and then you can slide. Of course, take your tensioner back off, and you can slide your plate to where it just touches your left and right. So as you can see now, I'm touching my left bracket, my right bracket's not touching, so I'll adjust the lead screw to where it just touches. Then from there, you can put your tensioner back on, tighten up your tensioner, and then run all your screws in for your backer plate. There are 10 screws, 3 on the front, left and right, then 4 on the back. Now that everything's in, we'll snug up our bracket to guide block M3 screws all the way around, or we'll tighten them up. Then we'll put the bed on, and we'll do a bed level calibration, and then we'll do our first print. We have our bed installed with our silicone spacers. With one set, I think the bed was too close to the plate. I didn't want the plate to warm up and to form the brackets. Our heated bed is plugged back in, and now we will put this thing back in its resting spot and do a bed calibration to set the screw height, and we'll do a test print.